June 12, 1974, 3:47 p.m., Danbury Federal Correctional Institution, Connecticut. Carlos Lehder sat in his cell, staring at the wall. He'd been in this prison for 8 months, caught smuggling 200 pounds of marijuana across the Canadian border in a stolen car. The dumbest mistake of his life. 5-year sentence, federal prison, surrounded by murderers, drug dealers, mob enforcers. Carlos was 24 years old, skinny, Colombian, alone. And in federal prison in 1974, if you were young, foreign and alone, you were prey. For 8 months, Carlos had kept his head down, stayed quiet, avoided trouble, but today that was about to change. Because today, 3 men cornered Carlos in the shower block, and what happened in the next 24 hours made Carlos Lehder untouchable for the rest of his life. This is that story. If you're already hooked, hit that subscribe button right now, because what Carlos Lehder did in this prison riot changed him from a nobody into a legend. Chapter 1. The Threat. The 3 men who cornered Carlos were part of the Aryan Brotherhood, white supremacist prison gang, violent, organized, controlled half the drug trade inside Danbury. Their leader was a guy named Jake the Bull Morrison, 6'4", 250 pounds, covered in swastika tattoos, serving 20 years for murder. Jake had been watching Carlos for weeks. Carlos was getting visits from his Colombian family. They were sending him money, putting it in his commissary account. In prison, money equals power, and Jake wanted Carlos's money. That afternoon, Jake and 2 of his men followed Carlos into the shower block, waited until Carlos was alone, then blocked the exits. Jake walked up to Carlos, stood over him, smiled. "You're Carlos, right? The Colombian kid?" Carlos didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, trying not to show fear. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Jake continued. "See, me and my boys, we provide protection in here, make sure nobody bothers you, make sure you stay safe, and all we ask in return is a little contribution, say $200 a month from your commissary. That's reasonable, right?" Carlos knew what this was: extortion, protection racket, pay or get beaten, or worse, most inmates paid. It was easier, safer, but Carlos wasn't most inmates. Carlos looked up at Jake, met his eyes. "No." Jake's smile faded. "What did you say?" "I said no, I'm not paying you anything." Jake's face went red, his jaw clenched. "You think you're tough, Colombian? You think you can just say no to me?" "I think," Carlos said calmly, "that if you want my money, you're going to have to kill me, because I'm not giving you a single dollar." The shower block went silent, the other inmates watching, shocked. Nobody talked to Jake Morrison like that, not if they wanted to live. Jake grabbed Carlos by the throat, slammed him against the wall. "Listen to me, you little spick. You're going to pay, or I'm going to make your life hell. I'm going to have my guys beat you every single day. I'm going to poison your food. I'm going to make sure you don't survive 6 months in here. You understand?" Carlos couldn't breathe. Jake's hand was crushing his windpipe, but Carlos smiled. "Do it," Carlos choked out. "Kill me right now, because if you don't, I'm going to make you regret threatening me." Jake released him, shoved him to the ground. "You've got 24 hours to get me my money. If I don't have $200 by tomorrow, you're a dead man." Jake and his men walked out. Carlos sat on the floor, gasping for air, his throat burning. The other inmates stared at him, some with pity, some with respect. One of them, an older black man named Marcus, walked over. "Kid, you just signed your death warrant. Jake doesn't make empty threats. You need to pay him." Carlos stood up. "I'm not paying him anything." "Then you're dead." Carlos smiled. "Maybe, or maybe Jake is." Smash that like button if you're realizing that Carlos Lehder just declared war on the most dangerous man in the prison. And what he does next is insane. Chapter 2. The Plan. Carlos went back to his cell, his mind racing. He had 24 hours. 24 hours to either come up with $200 or come up with a plan to survive Jake Morrison's revenge. Carlos didn't have $200. He'd spent most of his commissary money on books and supplies, so he needed a plan. Carlos thought about his situation. He was one man. Jake had an army. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled half the prison. The guards were either corrupt or didn't care. Carlos couldn't fight Jake alone. He'd lose. But what if Carlos didn't fight alone? What if Carlos turned the entire prison against Jake? Carlos spent the next 3 hours walking the cell blocks, talking to people, listening, learning. He discovered something interesting. Jake Morrison wasn't just extorting Carlos. He was extorting everyone. The black inmates, the Hispanic inmates, the Asian inmates, even some of the white inmates who weren't part of his gang. Everyone hated Jake, but nobody did anything because they were scared. Carlos realized something. Fear only works when people are divided, when they're isolated, when they think they're alone. But if Carlos could unite them, Carlos started talking to the leaders of the other prison groups. Marcus, the older black inmate who'd warned him in the shower. Marcus ran the black inmates, controlled their drug trade, their protection rackets. Carlos found Marcus in the yard, sat down next to him. "Marcus, how much are you paying Jake every month?" Marcus looked at him. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I think we can stop paying him. All of us." Marcus laughed. "Kid, Jake has 40 guys. We try to stop paying him, he'll start a war." "Exactly," Carlos said. "So we start the war first." Marcus stopped laughing. "You're serious?" "Completely. Jake threatened me today, gave me 24 hours to pay him or die. I'm not paying him, so I'm going to die, unless I take him down first. And I can't do that alone. But if we all work together, you, me, the Hispanics, the Asians, everyone, Jake is extorting. We outnumber him 3-1. Marcus thought about it. "What are you proposing? A riot? Tomorrow night? We make it look like it starts over something else. Food quality, guard brutality, whatever. But the real target is Jake and his gang. We isolate them, we make them vulnerable, and we take them out. You're talking about killing Jake Morrison. I'm talking about sending a message that we're not victims anymore, that if anyone tries to extort us, they pay the price." Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm in, but you need to convince the others. The Hispanics won't follow a Colombian kid they don't know. You need someone they trust." "Who?" "Pedro Alvarez. He runs the Hispanic inmates. Cell Block C. If you can convince him, you've got a shot." Chapter 3. Building the Alliance. Carlos found Pedro Alvarez in the prison library. Late 30s, Mexican, serving 15 years for drug trafficking. Carlos sat down across from him. "Pedro, we need to talk." Pedro looked up from his book. "I know who you are. You're the kid who told Jake Morrison to go fuck himself. That was either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. But I need your help." "Why would I help you?" "Because Jake is extorting you too. $200 a month, right? From every Hispanic inmate who has money. That's almost $2,000 a month total. Your money. Going to a white supremacist who uses it to buy drugs and weapons to keep you under his control." Pedro's expression didn't change. "And what do you want me to do about it?" "Tomorrow night we're starting a riot. The goal is to take down Jake and his gang. Make them weak, make them vulnerable. Show everyone in this prison that the Aryan Brotherhood isn't untouchable." Pedro closed his book. "A riot. You know how many people will get hurt." "I know, but how many people are getting hurt now? How many inmates are getting beaten because they can't pay? How many are getting raped? How many are getting killed? Jake Morrison has turned this prison into his kingdom, and the guards don't care because Jake pays them off. The only way to stop him is to destroy his power base." Pedro stared at Carlos. "You're 24 years old, you've been here 8 months, and you think you can take down a prison gang that's been running this place for 5 years? Not alone, but with you, with Marcus, with everyone Jake has victimized?" "Yes, I think we can." Pedro was silent for a long time. Then he said, "What's your plan?" Carlos laid it out, step by step. "Tomorrow night, during dinner, someone would start a fight. It would spread. Chaos. The guards would try to restore order. In the chaos, the alliance, black inmates, Hispanic inmates, Asian inmates, everyone would target Jake's gang. Isolate them, surround them, overpower them. The goal wasn't to kill them. The goal was to humiliate them, beat them, break them, show everyone in the prison that the Aryan Brotherhood could be defeated. Once Jake's power was broken, the extortion would stop, the violence would stop, and the prison would be controlled by a coalition instead of one gang." Pedro thought about it. "Okay," he said finally, "I'm in, but if this goes wrong, we're all dead. If we do nothing," Carlos replied, "we're all slaves. Subscribe right now, because the prison riot that Carlos Lehder is about to start will change everything. And what happens to Jake Morrison is legendary." Chapter 4. The Riot. June 13th, 1974, 6:15 p.m., dinner time. The prison cafeteria was packed. 300 inmates, 20 guards. Carlos sat at a table with Marcus and Pedro. They didn't speak, just nodded to each other. Across the room, Jake Morrison sat with his Aryan Brotherhood gang, 40 men, loud, confident. They owned this place. At 6:17 p.m., exactly as planned, a fight broke out. 2 inmates, one black, one Hispanic, both part of the alliance, started shouting at each other, stood up, threw punches. The guards rushed over. "Break it up, break it up." Then another fight started. On the other side of the cafeteria, more shouting, more punches. The guards split up, trying to contain both fights. Then a third fight started, and a fourth, and a fifth. Chaos erupted. Inmates started throwing trays, flipping tables, shouting. The guards were overwhelmed, called for backup on their radios. In the chaos, Carlos gave the signal. Marcus and his black inmates moved toward Jake's gang from the left. Pedro and the Hispanic inmates moved from the right. The Asian inmates blocked the exits. Jake's gang was surrounded. They didn't realize it at first, too busy watching the chaos, laughing, thinking this was just another prison riot. But then they saw the circle closing. Jake stood up, his eyes locked on Carlos, across the cafeteria. He knew. "Get them," Jake shouted, but it was too late. The Alliance moved in, over 100 inmates, against 40. The Aryan Brotherhood fought back. They were tough, violent, experienced, but they were outnumbered. The cafeteria turned into a war zone. Fists, chairs, trays, blood. The guards retreated, called for riot control, locked the cafeteria doors from the outside, trapped everyone inside. The fight lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, Jake Morrison was on the floor, beaten, bloodied, broken nose, black eyes, ribs cracked. His gang was scattered, defeated, humiliated. Carlos stood over Jake, looked down at him. "You had 24 hours to leave me alone," Carlos said quietly. "You chose violence. Now you know what happens when you threaten the wrong person." Jake tried to speak, coughed blood. Carlos turned and walked away. Chapter 5, The Aftermath. The guards regained control an hour later. Riot gear, batons, tear gas. 50 inmates were injured, 10 seriously. Nobody died. Jake Morrison and 15 of his gang members were sent to solitary confinement. The rest were transferred to other prisons. The Aryan Brotherhood's control over Danbury was broken. Carlos Lehder was also sent to solitary, 3 weeks. But when Carlos came out, everything had changed. Marcus, Pedro, and the other leaders came to see him. "You did it," Marcus said. "Jake is gone. His gang is gone. The prison is ours now." "Not mine," Carlos said. "Ours. We did it together." "Yeah, but it was your plan, your courage. You stood up when nobody else would. That makes you a leader." Carlos shook his head. "I'm not a leader. I'm just a guy who refused to be a victim." "That's what leaders do," Pedro said. From that day forward, Carlos Lehder was untouchable in Danbury Federal Prison. Nobody extorted him, nobody threatened him, nobody bothered him. Word spread to other prisons. The story of the 24-year-old Colombian kid who started a riot and destroyed the Aryan Brotherhood became legend. Years later, when Carlos was released and started building his cocaine empire, people who'd been in Danbury with him remembered. They remembered the kid who refused to be intimidated, the kid who united enemies against a common threat, the kid who turned fear into power. And when those same people heard that Carlos Lehder had become one of the most powerful drug lords in history, they weren't surprised, because they'd seen it in prison. They'd seen the moment Carlos decided he would never be a victim again. They'd seen the birth of a legend. Hit that like button if you think Carlos Lehder's prison riot was the moment he became the man who would later build a billion-dollar empire. Chapter 6, The Lesson. Years later, when a journalist asked Carlos about his time in Danbury, Carlos said, "Prison taught me the most important lesson of my life. Power doesn't come from being the strongest or the meanest. Power comes from refusing to accept that you're powerless." Jake Morrison thought he had power because he was big and violent and had 40 guys behind him. But he didn't understand that his power only existed because people accepted it. The moment we stopped accepting it, his power disappeared. That lesson applied to everything I did afterward. Building my empire, dealing with rivals, negotiating with Pablo Escobar. I never accepted that anyone had power over me. And that attitude, that refusal to submit, is what made me untouchable. The journalist asked, "Do you regret the violence?" Carlos was quiet for a moment. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret standing up. Because if I hadn't, I would have spent 5 years being extorted, beaten and broken. Instead, I spent 5 years earning respect. That respect saved my life a dozen times after I got out." Epilogue. The legend, the story of Carlos Lehder's prison riot, became one of the most famous stories in federal prison history. Inmates who were there told it to new inmates. Guards told it to other guards. It spread through the entire prison system. 20 years later, when Carlos was arrested again and sent back to prison, inmates who'd never met him already knew his name. They knew the story of the 24-year-old kid who started a riot and broke the Aryan Brotherhood, and they treated him with respect. Because Carlos Lehder had proven something in that riot, something that defined the rest of his life. He would never be controlled. He would never submit. He would never be a victim. And anyone who tried to make him one would pay the price. Leave a comment. If you were in Carlos's position, would you have paid the extortion money, or would you have started a riot? Rest in peace to those who fell in the Danbury riot. Long live Carlos Lehder, the man who refused to bow. The 24 hours that made him untouchable, the riot that became legend, the moment a victim became a leader, the end,